So we've covered the canvas in terms of the US role after 1945. First was to contain the Soviet Union, which it finally did after 1973. Second, of course, was to manage the Middle East, which it did until 1979. Third was to bring peace to Israel-Palestine conflict, which it tried, failed. And on the whole, the US policy after 9/11 has been one of keeping the status quo, keeping some sort of peace in the region, containing Iran, and after the disastrous invasion of Iraq, controlling the spread of Islamic State. Would that be fair? That sort of summary? Of course, I'm generalizing grossly and simplifying egregiously, but is this summary largely fair?
I think it is. With the launch of the attacks of 9/11 against the United States, the same sort of fear, paranoia, and hysteria which had gripped the United States in the late 40s and early 50s with respect to communism and the Soviet Union was transformed into this fear of terrorism. I mean, after all, it was an attack on the nation and the American heartland and New York City. You can't get any more American. And I mean, there's not a single American.
I thought Kansas was the heart of the US.
And you cannot meet a single American who was alive at that time and at least was, sufficiently mature to understand, who doesn't remember and can graphically explain to you what they saw in those days. I mean, after all, it was shown on television. And so there was this almost uncontrollable desire on the part of the Americans to exact their pound of flesh against those responsible. And
ironically, the Iraqis were not responsible. Saddam was a villain. He was a murderer.
Saddam Hussein was not. We should establish that.
He used chemical gas against the
Kurds. I mean, he's responsible for a lot of heinous acts.
Terrible to the Shia Arabs in the south, but he wasn't responsible for 9/11.
He was not. And although that was certainly used, because being vulnerable as they were, the Americans were susceptible to the argument that he was, because he was such a reprehensible person to begin with, and it wasn't hard for people to imagine that this is just what the evil Saddam would want to do. Not that he mourned what took place on 9/11, to be sure. And nevertheless, Mr. Bush launches his global war on terrorism. And the United States now jumps in full force with both feet. It's important to recall that this was not the first encounter, military encounter the United States was to have in the region in terms of a major scale. We should just touch on very briefly in 1990-91 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and George Bush Sr. Rallied a 35-nation coalition to include all the countries in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, all the Arab countries, which had heretofore been something unseen, in order to push the invading Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. Of course, it was led by the Americans with a lot of help from some Western allies, including Britain, France, Italy, and a number of others. And that war ended fairly quickly with the Iraqi troops expelled from Kuwait with very little losses on the side of the Americans in the American-backed coalition. And so the American troops pick up and leave. So all this is well and good. It presents the United States in a very favorable light to the Arabs in the region. Okay, one country aggressively invades and takes possession of another. The Americans come in, they make things right, and then they go back home. That's just what the Arabs liked, especially in Saudi Arabia. And so the Americans are still for the most part, despite not having delivered peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, still in good stead with many of the Arab countries. Maybe not to the extent that they would like to be because of the outstanding issue of Palestine, but nevertheless, most countries putting their eggs in the American basket. With the launch of the war on terrorism, although there was certainly no love lost on the part of all the Arab governments, there was some concern about the direction that this would take. And of course, that war was mostly directed to Afghanistan, which by my thinking is not necessarily, in fact, is not a part of the Middle East, although many Americans see it that way. It's
I don't see Afghanistan as a part of the Middle East.
no, not at all.
It is it is its own country.
Yes.
Taliban would say it's God's own country, and they are neither South Asia, they are nor the Middle East. They are certainly not a part of Central Asia either. They are a buffer state, as they always have been.
Exactly. But the Americans saw it as the U.S. going after Islamic extremists responsible for 9/11, and therefore, well, that's got to be in the Middle East. But in fact, indeed, for political, cultural, historical reasons, and even geographical in terms of the United States State Department, it's not part of the Middle East. So most of our efforts were
Afghanistan
directed
is the
toward
place where the great game was played between the Russian Empire and the British Empire.
exactly.
And the British tried to invade it a few times and suffered their greatest military defeats, or some of their greatest military defeats in Afghanistan. The Russians went in, when, of course, or let's say the Soviets went in, and they suffered
In
tremendously as
1979.
well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And suffered same fate as the Brits, only in more humiliating fashion. Because ultimately that would lead, it was one factor in the fall of the Soviet Union. And but nevertheless, the United States began to elevate all of its anti-terrorist activities throughout the region. Basically, almost our entire military apparatus was directed toward combating terrorism, specifically Al-Qaeda, but all the extremists, with all sorts of training programs and new relationships, intelligence relationships, security relationships, economic, all directed at combating extremism and terrorism throughout the Middle East. So the global war on terrorism, and people argue to this day whether there would have been a more surgical way to have gone about this. And given the ultimate outcome, I think we'd have to say yes. But what is interesting to note about all of this and its implications for the U.S. role in the Middle East is that there were members of the Bush administration. Recall that this is still the first couple of years of the Bush administration. They always had this notion in the back of their minds. These are certain members, sometimes known as the neocons, that we had to go after the real core of the problem in the Middle East, which was Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And I mean, days after George Bush took office in 2001, there were folks in his administration writing memos about this. And the day after 9/11, they amped up these efforts to turn our attention to dealing with what was seen as the true enemy of the United States and the enemy to regional peace, that being Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And this is when the various lies began circulating at the time, though some people believed them, that Saddam was involved with Al-Qaeda. Untrue. There may have been some Al-Qaeda operatives that passed through and had some dealings with Iraqi intelligence, but for the most part, the relationship was very, very minimal. After all, if you were familiar with the ideology of Al-Qaeda, they didn't like people like Saddam Hussein. They wanted
He was
him
a
removed too.
Ba'athist. He was a socialist. He was
He
a
was a
Ba'athist,
Ba'athist, a socialist.
just like the Assad family.
He was an enemy of Islam.
Yeah.
And so there really never could be any kind of a meaningful relationship between the two. That didn't stop the George Bush administration from mounting this effort until finally in March of 2003, the U.S. launched its invasion of Iraq under under the justification that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which it could ultimately use against U.S. allies in the region or even against the United States. And it was a very convincing argument. I mean, 75% of the American public supported it at the time, and it looked like the right thing to do. It became quickly apparent that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that after the first Gulf War, the UN weapons mission had pretty much eliminated all the nuclear related and most of the other, the chemical related WMD from the country. There were some remnants, but nothing that could be interpreted as any kind of a cogent threat against any of the countries, certainly not the United States. And so the United States, and George Bush in particular, his administration, had to turn very quickly and turn the justification for continuing the war in Iraq to promoting and establishing democracy in Iraq. This is the country that throughout its very, very long history, we're talking going back to the Babylonian period, prehistory, had absolutely zero experience, not only with democracy, with any of the fringes of democracy in terms of a free press, civil society institutions, none of this. Not the only political party was the Ba'ath Party, and they had complete control under the aegis of Saddam Hussein. And nevertheless,
debathification was such a brilliant idea. It led to such glorious results.
Well, the whole invasion from the get-go was a disaster. It's important to note that a number of officers within the State Department, career State Department officers, I'm sure there were others who did not manifest their objection in the same fashion in the Defense Department and the CIA, who stood out and communicated to the White House their opposition to this, and that it would likely not serve U.S. interests, and it could backfire on the United States. I'll note that one of those is none other than the current director of the CIA, Bill Burns, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, which included Iraq at the time. So there was considerable opposition of all the intelligence agencies. They all bought into the argument of weapons of mass destruction. All the American intelligence agencies, of which there are 18, I will point out. Only one.
18.
I thought it was 18. It could be 17. Irrespective, however, there was one who said, no, there was not convincing evidence of a WMD program in Iraq. And that particular intelligence agency is the smallest of the 17 or 18 in the US government. It's the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, located within the Department of State. So there was clear ambivalence about the justification and argument for the war, lots of suspicions, my own included. I never felt that the justification was there, that the agency could make, the CIA could make convincing argument about the presence of WMD. But I'm going to step back and say these are two bookends, which turned out to be colossal, or the Iraq War and the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953 turn out to be bookends to
exactly 50 years apart, 1953, 2003.
Exactly 50 years apart of major U.S. involvement in the Middle East. And I want to point out that these were two colossal mistakes, in my view, that will certainly rank among some of the worst ever made in the history of U.S. foreign policy, that in between, the United States registered a lot of successes. And in terms of American interest, and we have to remember that we make foreign policy decisions to serve American interest and hopefully the interest of our allies, it is usually, the ledger is usually more favorable if you look at that in terms of trying to tamp down the Arab-Israeli conflict, largely a success, not an entire success, some notable failures. Ensuring that the Soviets never were able to establish a beachhead in the Middle East of any significance, so that they might be able to control the region's resources. It never happened. And secondly, to ensure the stability of the oil markets, with the possible exception, noted exception actually, of 1973.
And 79 as well.
And then in 79, the two oil shocks generally worked pretty effectively. And so on those three issues, you'd have to say, okay, yeah, in the United States gets pretty good marks. But unfortunately, those successes, as I said, are bookended by these two disasters. And they both really leave a lasting impression on the people of the region, people of Iran, most definitely, but also all the Arab countries who saw the error of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, most especially the people of Iraq.
So, US foreign policy after 2003, war on terror, global war on terror, a colossal mistake. But the US recalibrates. It first goes through a surge, then it pulls back. The US has pulled out of Afghanistan as well, which some people thought was in the Middle East. And the US
Americans did.
yes, Americans did. And the US has managed to tackle the Islamic State. So, and under Obama, there was a brief period of romance, and that disintegrated with the Syrian civil war, and then of course we had the glorious Trump years, Donald Trump and his 4 years, and the Abraham Accords. So, paint us a picture of post-Iraq war U.S. foreign policy, and let's get into the more modern phase after that.
I think you'd have to look at the presidency of Barack Obama as the turning point. I mean, it was George Bush who kind of set the stage with the global war on terrorism and the decision to invade Iraq, and so that set in the direction. But Barack Obama really tried to catapult or try to pivot away from that, and that's exactly the word that he used.
Asia pivot.
To move U.S. attention away from the Middle East and toward Asia, where the greater threat to the United States and U.S. interests lie. And to some extent, he succeeded in doing that. The error was thinking that we could turn our backs on the Middle East. And you never want to do that. And he learned the hard way with the eruption of ISIS in Syria and later in Iraq. That required the reinsertion of U.S. forces to put that terrorist threat down, along with our Arab allies, most especially Iraq and Jordan. And then, of course, as you said, the outreach to Iran to try to address the rising threat of a potential nuclear weapons program in Iran. And he brokers this 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which leads to the cessation of all activities related to Iran's nuclear weapons program. It came under much criticism in the United States, and indeed it was not a perfect agreement, but it achieved its principal objective, which was that the Iranians ceased all activity related to developing their nuclear weapons, and the United States began lifting some of the sanctions and released the funds that we had impounded ever since the '79 revolution, which were sizable in the billions. Therefore, it looked like the United States was now pursuing a more constructive path in the region. Unfortunately, all of that was undermined by the presidency of Donald Trump, who overturned the JCPOA and effectively renewed the mutually spiteful relationship between the United States and Iran, and it has not improved since. Moreover, with his withdrawal from the JCPOA, it meant that Iran could and eventually did renew its efforts to develop nuclear weapons, and to build up its nuclear weapons program. And it has done that much to the consternation of the countries in the region, most especially to Saudi Arabia, right next door.
Which has an informal deal with Pakistan to get nuclear weapons, should it need.
That's the understanding. I believe it too. I certainly have not seen it, but given the fact that the Saudis have bankrolled Pakistan's nuclear weapons development program, one has to believe that there is something to that effect in whatever deal they had made. Be that as it may, the other really critical turning point also during the Trump administration was, I believe, the 2019 attack by most definitely Iran, although they never claimed credit for it, against the major oil facility in the middle of Saudi Arabia known as Abqaiq. Abqaiq is the largest oil complex in the world. 7% of the world's oil goes through that single facility. Other oil goes through other locations in Saudi Arabia, but none of the dimension of Abqaiq. So they have launched multiple drone and missile attacks against Abqaiq, and the Saudis fully expect the Americans to respond, and Donald Trump refuses. The argument being that no Americans were killed or injured. Americans did not have any direct interest there, so therefore no need for the Americans to act. And that
also a very important point, Gary, for our viewers and listeners to know, is that somewhere America becomes self-sufficient in oil, and the discovery of natural gas means America is now an energy surplus nation. So the need to defend, say, oil facilities in the Middle East is probably more greatly felt by China, which is the biggest importer of Saudi oil, or India, which is the second biggest importer of Saudi oil. It's not my clown, not not my circus, not my clowns syndrome.
Exactly. The United States had begun actually many years, if not decades before, to become self-sufficient in oil, having suffered the two oil shocks, the 1970s that we mentioned earlier. And given the varying price of oil during the periods of high oil prices, oil companies and wildcatters and so forth were furiously looking for alternative oil sources, exploiting the ones that existed in places like Texas and Oklahoma, Louisiana, here in my home state of Colorado, but elsewhere, including in places we never would have imagined oil, places like Pennsylvania, southern New York, and
things like fracking, shale gas, all these came
and then
into
this
being.
new technology comes on board known as fracking, which allows the user to exploit shale oil in situ. That is, you don't have to bring it to the surface and go through this long and complex and pollution-ridden process to refine it to the point where it can be used. You frack it beneath the ground, and then you take the oil out of the ground. And that's when the United States began to realize that we were far richer in our oil resources than we ever could have imagined. And this includes not only oil, but most especially gas. So now we find places like, as I mentioned, Eastern Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, who have become very prosperous, capitalizing on their oil and gas resources. Other states could. We know now that areas in North Dakota are being exploited and are very rich in the same sort of thing, even in Michigan, although I don't think they're being exploited at the moment, and other places in the United States. So this really transformed the United States' energy picture so that we eventually become self-sufficient. We still import a little, only because it makes economic sense to do so, but we could easily turn off all the external spigots to our oil and gas machinery and operate quite comfortably. It may be somewhat more expensively. But in some respects, we still remain susceptible to the Middle East because the world's most influential swing producer remains, as has always been the case, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia can turn on the spigot and turn off the spigot without any harm to itself. It can always pump what it needs. It can always pump what it needs in order to maintain its economy, although during periods of low oil prices, it too has suffered briefly. But the Saudis are the only ones in the world who can do that. And as a result, they ultimately determine the world price of oil, including the price here in the United States, our own domestically produced oil. Not so much in the sense of gas, however. Gas is more market determined, but oil, although largely market determined, the market is heavily influenced by, of course, the volumes on the market. And who influences the volume the most? Saudi Arabia. So we still have that iron in the fire that we have to eye carefully. So with the United States' unwillingness to come to the aid of Saudi Arabia, it becomes, again, a major inflection point in our relations and ties with the countries of the Middle East. Now, let's take a retrospective view from that point, because it wasn't that single issue that kind of changes how the people and governments of the Middle East view the United States and its role in the region. It was a series of events, and we've mentioned some of them, but one very critical one occurred in late 2009 and then played out through 2010 and 11. Of course, that's the Arab Spring, where we saw uprisings in the streets of Cairo, Tunis, Sana'a, Damascus. In fact, virtually every single Arab capital, all of them, saw massive uprisings against
Not in Saudi Arabia, though.
There were even some in Saudi Arabia, but largely controlled. But massive ones right next door in Manama that required
in Bahrain.
The intervention of Saudi forces to tamp down. So this erupts, and of course they're going after all the leaders, for the most part, who had been close allies of the United States. Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, foremost among them, but all of them, where some had some form of allyship with the United States, some closer than others, but Hosni Mubarak was extremely close to the United States. And of course, these demonstrators, who, at least in the case of Egypt, were coming out in the millions, but in the tens, even hundreds of thousands elsewhere, were demanding a greater say in their government. Basically, liberalization, even democratization. And a lot of them spoke the words of democratization without necessarily understanding what that might mean. Certainly greater freedoms and accountability of their governments and greater say in how they were governed. Well, this is not a movement that the United States could oppose. I mean, the United States has always been adamantly supportive of democratic movements around the world and human rights. And so we were not going to criticize these movements. And then that put Hosni Mubarak in a very difficult position. And Barack Obama agonized, but he and his administration agonized how we would deal with this, because we couldn't be certain of what would follow if Mubarak were to fall. In the end, the United States felt obliged to call for his resignation, and that pretty much spelled the end of his presidency in Egypt. Similarly, we put up no opposition to the fall of Muhammad Ali in Tunis, and Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. And so these all began to fall like dominoes, greatly alarmed the Gulf states, who, more than anything else, are most fearful of stability. And this is one of the key reasons why they formed a strong relationship with the United States, is that because we both had this fundamental interest in preserving Middle East stability. And now they see this unraveling, and the United States appears to be abetting it by not objecting to any of these leaders stepping
So
aside.
from the Arab leaders' perspectives, the US threw its allies under the bus. The US turned out to be disloyal at their hour of need.
From their narrow perspective, most definitely. And as I explained, because I was still a diplomat in the region at the time, I said, please understand, democracy is in the DNA of America. And it would be extremely difficult for any president of the United States to support the continued rule of a dictator in the face of what appears to be a genuinely democratic, by all the uncertain signs, movement. And so we called for the resignation of Mubarak. We also called for the resignation of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, but he turned to his friends in Iran and subsequently to
Russia.
in Russia in order to shore up his flagging efforts to repel the rebels in his own country. So he outlasted the Arab Spring. And if you look at this again from the perspective of the Arab leaders, that Assad's allies came to his aid and preserved his rule, whereas Mubarak and Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, when they turned to their American backers, the Americans basically did the old two-step. They could not do it. They were unable to do it. Yes, we intervened diplomatically to try and find a solution to this in order to ensure some kind of a peaceful transition. And indeed, very, very briefly, we were able to do this, most certainly in the case of Tunis, although all credit goes to the Tunisians for pulling that off, and even more briefly in the case of Yemen. I always cite one quote by Ali Abdullah Saleh when he was president of Yemen. He likened governing the state of Yemen to dancing on the head of snakes. And indeed, for him, he put his foot in the wrong place in one particular time. And that was the one mistake that he clearly made. He was bitten by the snake, and it was the Houthis who actually were instrumental in engineering his assassination in Sana'a. But so the Americans now have shown that they're not willing to commit blood, maybe treasure, but certainly not blood, to defend any of these autocratic leaders. And so that really had a telling effect, particularly on the countries of the Gulf, most especially Saudi Arabia. And so it really gets us to the point today, Atul, is what is the United States' role in the Middle East, the whole point of our conversation. And
how is it changing? Why is it so fast changing?
And there are a variety of reasons. I mean, this whole historical review is part of it because the region has changed. The character of the region has changed.
So first, the region itself has changed, and therefore the role of the US is bound to change with it.
Yes, and the United States is trying to adapt to that. And secondly, because of the changing character of the region, we see many more players within the region. Before, very few actors in the region, with the exception of Iran, of course, acted without consulting the United States. Today, that is not the case. Sometimes they may merely inform the United States, and sometimes they may simply ignore the United States. That is, they are independent actors, and these are countries like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, most certainly Iran, less so Egypt than it was previously, just because of its own problems at the moment. But then we have, well, I said Turkey already, one outside player, but then now we have also Russia reappearing in the region, but constrained in terms of the things that it might do because of its war of aggression in Ukraine, and then most especially China. Now, China cannot hope, at least in the near to medium term, replace the United States in terms of the security that it provides for the region. But certainly economically and politically, China is playing an increasing role in the Middle East. So that's
Well,
the second factor.
part
More
of it
players.
is China doesn't have its own energy. China is completely, but greatly reliant on the Middle East for its oil and gas needs. It is the biggest importer of Saudi oil. So obviously, if I was buying a great amount of stuff from you, both of us would have a certain dependency. I need energy, you need the money. It's a symbiotic relationship.
True. However, because of events elsewhere, namely Ukraine, and all the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia now, uh, Russia is desperate to find buyers of its oil, and China was most willing to do so, but is in a most advantageous bargaining position, A, because of the sanctions, and B, because there's a surplus of oil coming out of Russia. Russia needs to get it off its hands, and so it's selling increasing volumes of very cheap oil, probably greater than it costs to produce, but not by much, certainly far below the profits it could be having right now with the high price of oil. And so I think in recent months, Russia has now become the principal supplier of Chinese oil, and no longer the Middle East. And by the Middle East, I mean not only Saudi Arabia, but also Iran
Iran,
and some
of
of the
course.
some of the other countries. So that's a real important factor to keep in mind, is that with these increased players, all the countries in the Middle East has somewhere else to turn besides the United States, with one exception, and that of course has always been and remains the ability of the United States to deploy sufficient forces to provide necessary security these countries might need. And if there was ever any doubt about that, all we need to do is refer to the events of early April, when Iran launched this barrage of drones and missiles against Israel, some 320 of these against Israel. The United States, working in conjunction with not only its traditional allies, Britain and France, but also Jordan and other Arab countries, was able to share necessary intelligence information with Israel so that it could protect itself, and moreover, to launch counterfire against these incoming drones and missiles, so that there were no lives lost in Israel during this massive attack on a part of Iran. And then, of course, the Israelis launched their own attack, far fewer missiles, but sent exactly the message they wanted to say to the Iranians, and that is, we can strike you too, wherever we want, and we don't need a massive barrage to do it. And so, but the critical role that the United States played was very evident to all the countries in the region, that the United States still is the top dog when it comes to security in the region,
Security.
and nobody really comes close,
So,
and that's something that cannot be discounted.
so speaking of security, October 7th happened um, last year, and October 7th, 2023 happened exactly 50 years in one day after Yom Kippur, 1973. So since then, there has been conflict, and since then, the US has found its popularity increasing amongst Arab populations, and there is an unease even amongst Arab regimes. The Abraham Accords, which the Trump administration negotiated, were to be followed by a grand bargain between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That is off the books. And now the US is in a trickier situation, at least in the court of public opinion, if not the rulers.
And I'm glad you added that final note, if not the rulers, because this grand bargain, in terms of the United States providing stepped up security for Saudi Arabia, is still very much in play. In fact, the latest I've read is that they are very, very close to doing a straightforward bilateral agreement that ties the two countries together in terms of security and some other areas. And so this could be, it's sort of a Abraham Accords light for the very simple reason that without Israel, we don't have the normalization that was able to take place under the Trump administration with the understandings and the agreements that were negotiated with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. That may come, but the real sort of stick in the spokes here is not so much the Israelis, who by and large would love to see this and want this, nor the Israelis, the Saudis, at least the Saudi government, who also wants this. They see the advantages that the UAE in particular has acquired as a result of this relationship, particularly on the economic and technology side, and they want a part of this. They want a part of the action, and not to mention all the intelligence gains that they could expect with a normalization with Israel. So they want all of that. All the previous sort of historic obstacles to negotiating with the Israelis are by the boards, except for one. They have to be able to show credibly to their public that there is an observable opportunity for a Palestinian state. And that requires the acknowledgement by the current leader of Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that yes, indeed, he is willing to negotiate a two-state agreement with the Palestinians. Barring that, it's difficult to do this three-way type of agreement that the United States had initially sought before October 7th. But there's nothing to prevent the United States and Saudi Arabia from doing their own deal. And I think that's extremely in play, and we may actually see it. It just won't include the Israeli component if and until either Bibi Netanyahu bends, which I suspect he won't because he will lose his coalition, or we see new leadership in Jerusalem. But
Benny Gantz has left the government.
Mr. Gantz
and he
has left
was
government.
The head of he was a popular head of Israeli military, credible figure, the most centrist figure in the war cabinet. So things are not looking good for Israel. We've touched upon that earlier, but particularly
Yes.
it is now complicating US role in the region because of a very intransigent and dare I say almost disrespectful attitude towards the US.
Yes, and Bibi, being the very clever politician that he is, uses this as a political weapon to further his own parochial interests in Israel, that he stands up to the Americans. This could come back to bite him, because you can only do this for so long before the Americans decide he's not worth the candle. And by the way, if he can do it to a Democratic president, he can just as easily do it to a Republican one. This is something that the Republicans are slow learning. They may learn, but there is an evolution in American views toward Israel now taking place within this country. Younger Americans, I'm saying, certainly under 30, but even under 40, are changing their views, their attitudes toward the state of Israel. There no longer is this universal support. Well, certainly the support for Israel, but also very harsh criticism for Israel's resistance to recognizing a Palestinian state. And I mean, we saw this with the demonstrations on American university campuses during April and May. We see fewer today because universities are out of session, depending what happens these may restart come fall. Be that as it may, I think it's important to ask the question today. So what are U.S. interests in the region today, and how does that necessitate a particular role for the United States? And one interest that has not changed since Mr. Roosevelt met with Saudi King Abdulaziz in 1945, stability in the region. Instability in the region leads to all kinds of unpredictable outcomes, as we saw with 9/11 and other events, and therefore the United States must strive to preserve stability in the region. Therefore, maintaining the extent that we can a security presence is going to be necessary, mostly sort of a collaborative one with the militaries and the intelligence agencies of the various governments with which we work. But I will note, when people talk about the changing role of the United States, they base it on U.S. troop presence during the early 2000s, and that's a false measurement. Of course, we had as many as 170,000 at its peak U.S. troops in Iraq. We had not quite that many in Afghanistan. Those days are by the board, and I don't think they're ever going to be repeated. And that's not the yardstick for measuring the U.S. role. But the United States has to remain engaged for the principal reason I just mentioned: preserving regional stability, maintaining the stability of the price of oil because of the impact that can have on the global economy. Increased oil prices causes disruption in the global economy, which leads to all kinds of political spin-offs that are unpredictable. And it's predictability that we all want to see, whether it's governments, whether it's businesses, even publics, although not always. And so there is this imperative to strive for stability in the region. The need to support Israel is not as great as it was before. And therefore, we'll have to see how that particular issue evolves. Previously, say before 2000 or 2010, most definitely, that was a pillar of U.S. policy in the region, and that is supporting Israel's security and protecting the state of Israel. Israel has shown itself to be perfectly capable of doing that itself, although sometimes needing the support of the United States, particularly in confronting Iran. There is a third concern, and it probably relates to the stability in the region. We now have a number of groups, all of them connected in various ways with Iran, that are factors for considerable instability. Principal among those is Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. An all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel would create massive instability in the region and invariably draw other countries into the war, including the United States, I would have to say. I can't say how directly. That's just not predictable at this point. But we also have the Houthis in Yemen, who are disrupting shipping traffic through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And then we have various militia groups in Syria and Iraq that create instability in those areas. And then finally, of course, there's Hamas in Gaza, which still continues to receive support from Iran as well. So the real disruptor today in terms of region stability, and therefore of greatest concern to the United States, is Iran. And so for those reasons, the United States is unable to turn its back on the Middle East, even though it will not require the investment, at the very least, of military assets to the extent that we had before.
So the fast changing role of the US now is not so much the protection of Israel, not so much containing the Soviets, not so much fighting the war on terror, but on containing Iran, its proxies, and maintaining stability through closer relationships, particularly with the Gulf countries.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Those are the two critical areas of concern for the United States. Now, I think it sort of lingers, and many people say it's actual feature of U.S. policy in the region. I tend to disagree, and that is the increased role that China could potentially play. For the moment, that does not appear to be the case. Certainly on the economic front, China is playing an increasing role and will continue to play an even greater role just because of the size of their economy. It's in their interests, and it's in the interest of all the countries that now conduct economic relations of one form or another with China. So we shouldn't attempt to block that, nor do I think we ever could. So let those unfold. To the extent that their political efforts can be constructive, so far they have not, then fine. Let them try, although I think they're a bit hesitant. They understand the conflicted nature of this part of the world, and they're hesitant to stick their hand in that wood chipper. And for that reason, I think they'll be very cautious about engaging politically in the Middle East. We may see it here and there, but what we have seen up to this point is them capitalizing on the difficulties and the challenges that the Americans are facing in the Middle East, namely dealing with the Houthis, or dealing with the current war in Gaza, or dealing with Iran, and using that, so to speak, as a bludgeon against the United States to influence public opinion in the region. And given that we are involved and they are not, it's probably not unusual that they would do this. But playing a constructive role, I don't see the Chinese doing that as of yet.
The US will continue to play a role, and the US role will keep changing as the region changes.
The United States will have to adopt a very flexible and adaptable position throughout the entire Middle East, for all the reasons that I mentioned, as well as to increasing concerns for European security, given the behavior of Russia of late, and the rising power of China, and the challenge that it poses to the US and the US interest in Asia. So we always have to keep those uppermost, because if you look at Russia and China, those come far closer to posing existential challenges to the United States than anything in the Middle East. And that's an important point to bear in mind.
So the Asia pivot, which Barack Obama began, has to go on. But you have to keep an eye on the Middle East in the meantime.
Without question.
Excellent. On that note, Gary, thank you. Thank you for your time. A most enthralling discussion as ever.
My pleasure. It's good to speak with you again, Atul.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.